In the churchyard. My name is Philip Pirrip, but as a child I could not say my name. I called myself Pip, and that has been my name ever since. I never knew my mother and father. They both died when I was a baby. I was brought up by my only sister, who was married to a blacksmith, Joe Gargery. My story begins on a cold, grey winter afternoon in the churchyard where my parents are buried. I would often go to their graves and look down at the words on their gravestone. Philip Pirrip and Georgiana, wife of the above. I was a sensitive and lonely child and was often sad. The marshes beyond the churchyard were grey. The river beyond the marshes was a darker line of grey. A bitter wind was blowing across the marshes from the sea. The graveyard was a dark and frightening place. I shivered. Cold and afraid, I began to cry.
"Quiet, you little devil!"
cried a terrible voice.
"Keep still, or I'll cut your throat!"
A rough-looking man had taken hold of me. He held me tightly by the neck. "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir," I cried. "Please don't." The man's rough grey clothes were torn and muddy. Like me, he was shivering with cold. His shoes were old and broken. He had a torn piece of cloth tied round his head, and his eyes were wild and terrible.
"Tell me your name,"
the man growled.
"Tell me, quick!"
"Pip, sir, Pip," I answered.
"Show me where you live,"
the terrible man demanded. I pointed towards our village, which was about a mile away from the churchyard. The man stared at me for a moment. Then, with a sudden movement, he picked me up and turned me upside down. A piece of bread fell out of my pocket. The man pushed me onto a gravestone. Then he grabbed the bread and began eating greedily. I sat on the gravestone where he had put me, shivering and crying with fear.
"Now, tell me, where's your mother?"
the man in grey asked suddenly. "There, sir," I answered, pointing over his shoulder to my mother's grave. The man looked behind him and started to run. "I mean, she's buried there, sir. That's my mother. Georgiana, wife of the above."
"Oh, I see,"
the man said, limping slowly back.
"And is that your father there, buried with your mother?"
"Yes, sir," I replied.
"Then who do you live with?"
the man asked.
"That is, if I let you live,"
he said roughly. "With my sister, sir. Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, sir."
"A blacksmith, is he?"
the man muttered, looking down at his leg. There was a thick band of iron round his ankle, with a broken chain hanging from the band. The man came nearer. He took hold of my arms and tipped me back over the gravestone as far as I could go. His terrible eyes stared into mine.
"Now look here," he said. "Do you know what a file is?"
"Yes, sir."
"Then you get me a file, and you get me some food. Do you understand?"
"Yes, sir."
"Bring me, early tomorrow morning, a file and some food," the man repeated slowly. "Bring them to the old fort over there by the river. Say nothing to no one, and maybe I'll let you live. But if you tell anyone about me," the terrible man said slowly, "your heart and liver will be torn out, roasted and ate. Now, I'm not alone," he went on. "There's a young man near here, listening to every word I say. He has a secret way of finding a boy, wherever he is. Even if a boy is warm in bed behind a locked door, that young man will find him. What do you say to that?
I promised I would bring him the file and the food very early in the morning.
Lord strike me dead if I don't. Say it,
the man growled. Lord, strike me dead if I don't, I repeated. The man lifted me down from the gravestone. Then he held his arms around his shivering body. Good night, sir, I whispered.
Nothing much good about it,
the man replied, looking across at the wet and windy marshes.
I wish I was a frog or a fish.
He limped off through the churchyard towards the marshes. He turned once to look back at me. I began to run home as fast as I could. When I got home, the forge was shut up. Joe had finished work for the day. I opened the door of the house. I crept quietly into the warm kitchen and saw Joe sitting alone by the fire smoking his pipe. Joe Gargery was a huge, fair-haired man with kind blue eyes. He looked at me sadly. "Mrs. Joe has been out looking for you, Pip," Joe told me. "She's out there now, Pip, and she's got Tickler with her." This was very bad news. Tickler was a stick that I had often felt on my thin body. For although I had food, clothes, and shelter, my sister was a hard and angry woman and would often beat me. Her husband, Joe, was my only friend. "Has she been out long, Joe?" I asked nervously. "Well," said Joe, looking up at the clock, "this time she's been out about 5 minutes. And I hear her coming back, Pip, old chap," Joe added. "Get behind the door." My sister pushed open the door with a bang. She soon saw where I was hiding and beat me until I cried. Then she threw me angrily across the kitchen to where Joe was sitting. Joe quietly placed me in the corner near the fire and protected me with his own powerful body. My sister was 20 years older than me. She was tall and thin, with a hard face and sharp black eyes. The rough red skin on her bony hands and face made her always look angry. "Where have you been, you young monkey?" Mrs. Joe cried, stamping her foot. "Tell me what you've been doing all this time." "I've been in the churchyard," I answered, crying. "Churchyard?" Mrs. Joe repeated sharply. "You'd have been in the churchyard long ago if it hadn't been for me. Who brought you up? Tell me that." "You did," I sobbed. "And why I did, I don't know," my sister exclaimed. "It's bad enough looking after this blacksmith, without being your mother too. One of these days you'll drive me to the graveyard, the pair of you." Joe said nothing. He was a simple, gentle man, and he never complained about Mrs. Joe's bad temper. But he protected me when he could, and I loved him for it. It was Christmas Eve, and Mrs. Joe was very busy. She was making the food for the Christmas meal next day. She made me stir the mixture for the Christmas pudding for an hour, and then I was allowed to sit by the fire with Joe. As I sat by the warm fire, I thought of the man on the cold, wet marshes. I remembered my promise to him. I thought of the young man who would find me and kill me if I broke that promise. The silence of the quiet night was suddenly broken by loud noises that seemed to come from the sea. "Are those the great guns, Joe?" I asked. Joe nodded. "Another convict's escaped," he said. "One got away last night, and the guns were fired for him. Now they're giving warning that a second one has escaped." "Who's firing the guns?" I asked. "Ask no questions and you'll be told no lies," my sister snapped in reply. "Mrs. Joe," I said politely, I really should like to know, if you don't mind, where the firing comes from."
"From the hulks! The hulks!" my sister answered.
"And please, what are the hulks?"
"Hulks are prison ships moored on the other side of the marshes," Mrs. Joe explained impatiently.
"I wonder who's put into prison ships and why they're put there," I said.
Mrs. Joe leapt up and grabbed me by the ear. "People are put in the hulks because they murder and rob and do all kinds of bad things," she said, "and they all begin by asking questions." Mrs. Joe pulled my ear hard as she spoke and gave me a push. "And now go off to bed," she added. I went slowly up the dark stairs, thinking about the terrible prison ships. I had begun by asking questions, and in a few hours I was going to steal from Mrs. Joe. I slept very little that night. I was afraid of Mrs. Joe. I was afraid of the convict on the marshes. And most of all, I was afraid of the terrible young man. At last, the grey light of dawn came into the sky. I got up and dressed. Quietly and carefully, I crept downstairs to the pantry. I found some bread, a piece of cheese, and a large bone with some meat on it. There was a bottle with a little brandy in it, and I took that too. Last of all, on the top shelf, I found a beautiful round meat pie. A door in the kitchen led into the forge. I unlocked the door and looked for a file among Joe's tools. Then, locking the door behind me, I walked back through the kitchen. Turning the big key, I opened the house door carefully. In a few moments, I was running as fast as I could towards the fort on the misty marshes. It was a frosty morning, and very damp and cold. The grass was wet, and water dripped from the trees. The mist was so thick over the marshes that I could only see a few feet ahead of me. As I ran, trees, cows, and gates seemed to lean out of the mist to stop me. I knew the fort well, but in my terror I almost lost my way. I had just crossed a ditch when I saw the man in grey. He was sitting on the ground with his back to me. I walked up to him quietly and touched his shoulder. He jumped up and turned to face me. It was not the same man, but he was dressed in the same rough clothes as the man I had met. He too had an iron on his leg. It was the young man, waiting to tear my heart and liver out. With a cry, I ran on until I had reached the fort, and there was my convict. He was swinging his arms and walking up and down to keep warm. The man grabbed the food from my hand and began eating in great mouthfuls like a dog. When he drank the brandy, he shivered so violently that his teeth nearly broke the bottle. As he started to eat the pie, I spoke to him. "I'm glad you're enjoying it, sir," I said. "Thank you, my boy. I am," he replied. "Aren't you leaving anything for him?" I asked anxiously. "Him? Oh, the young man. Oh, he doesn't need any food," the convict replied. "Doesn't he? I thought he looked hungry," I said. "Looked? When did you see him?" "Just now," I answered. "Where?" "Over there," I said, pointing. "I thought he was you," I explained. The man stopped eating and grabbed my jacket. "What did the man look like?" he asked me fiercely. He was dressed like you, and he had an iron on his leg," I answered. "And there was a long scar on his face." "Was there?" the convict cried. "So, he's escaped from the hulks, has he? I thought I heard the guns last night. Where is he? I must find him. Curse this iron on my leg. Give me that file, boy, and tell me where you saw him.
I pointed to where I'd seen the young man. The convict stared through the mist. Then, sitting down on the wet grass, he began to file at the heavy iron on his leg. The sky was lighter now, and I dared not stay any longer. My sister and Joe would soon be awake. They would be looking for me. I began to walk quietly away. When I looked back, the convict was bent over, filing at the iron on his leg. When I looked back again, I could see nothing through the thick mist. But I could still hear the sound of the file as it cut through the heavy leg iron. Chapter 2. Christmas Day. When I got home, Mrs. Joe was too busy preparing our Christmas dinner to ask me questions. I sat down quietly by Joe. Our dinner was to be at 1:30. Long before that, I was scrubbed clean by Mrs. Joe and dressed in my best clothes. It was my job to open the door to our guests, 3 of our neighbours, and Uncle Pumblechook. Uncle Pumblechook was a fat, stupid man with hair that stood up on his head. He greatly admired my sister, but thought very little of Joe and myself. He had brought 2 bottles of wine, and he gave them to Mrs. Joe with a bow and a smile. Everyone was soon eating and drinking happily. Everyone except me. I was terrified. Was Mrs. Joe going to serve the pie today? When would she discover it was missing? Dinner seemed to be finished, when my sister suddenly spoke to Joe. "Fetch clean plates," she ordered. I held on tight to the table leg. I knew what was going to happen. My sister smiled at her guests. "And now you must all taste another gift from Uncle Pumblechook," she said. "It's a delicious meat pie."
"Well, Mrs. Joe, this has been a wonderful meal," Uncle Pumblechook said happily. "But I think I could eat a slice of that meat pie."
My sister hurried into the pantry, and Uncle Pumblechook picked up his knife and fork.
"You shall have a slice of pie, Pip," Joe whispered to me.
I could not sit there any longer. Did I cry out or not? I can't remember. But I jumped up and ran towards the front door. At the same moment, Mrs. Joe came back from the pantry. "What's happened to the meat pie?" she cried. I opened the door and ran, straight into a group of soldiers. Their leader, a sergeant, was holding out a pair of handcuffs.
"Now then, young man,"
the sergeant said sharply as he marched into our kitchen.
"Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," he went on. "We're chasing escaped convicts, and we need the blacksmith."
"What do you want him for?" my sister asked in surprise.
"Well, I'd like to stay and talk to his charming wife," the sergeant replied. "But today we're busy with the king's business. We need the blacksmith to do a little job for us."
Joe stood up, and the sergeant held out the handcuffs.
"There's something wrong with these, blacksmith," the sergeant said. "We need them today, so I'd like you to mend them."
Joe took the handcuffs in his great hand. "I'll have to light the fire in the forge," he said. "This job will take about 2 hours."
"That'll be all right," the sergeant answered. "We're sure that the convicts are still on the marshes. We'll capture them before it's dark. No one has seen them, I suppose?"
Everyone except me shook their heads. No one thought of asking me. Joe took off his coat and got ready for work. With the soldiers' help, the forge fire was soon burning fiercely. As Joe hammered the white-hot iron, we all stood round and watched him. Mrs. Joe gave the soldiers some beer. Uncle Pumblechook poured out wine for the sergeant, and then poured some for everyone else. Even I got a little wine. We stood in the forge, laughing and talking. I thought sadly of the 2 convicts, cold and hungry on the marshes. At last, the handcuffs were mended. Joe asked the sergeant if he could follow the soldiers while they searched for the convicts.
"Certainly, blacksmith. Bring the boy with you if you like," the sergeant answered.
"Well," my sister said sharply, "if he gets his head shot off, don't ask me to mend it."
Joe lifted me up onto his broad shoulders. As we began to follow the soldiers, I whispered in his ear, "I hope, Joe, that we don't find them." And Joe whispered back, "Let's hope they've got away, Pip, old chap." It was dark now. On our way to the marshes, the bitter wind blew icy rain into our faces. The group of soldiers moved quickly. We went at a fast pace, sometimes stumbling on the rough ground, sometimes falling. At last, we were on the marshes, splashing in and out of the ditches full of icy water. Suddenly, we heard a shout. We stopped and listened. The shout was repeated, and then we heard another. The sergeant sent us to the right. On we ran, even faster, splashing through ditches, up and down steep banks. And now we could hear that 2 men were shouting.
"Murder!"
One cried.
"Convicts! This way for the escaped convicts!"
shouted the other. The 2 men were fighting at the bottom of a ditch. They were splashing in the muddy water. The men were cursing and hitting out at each other. When the soldiers pulled the men from the ditch, both of the convicts were torn and bleeding. My convict wiped the blood from his face with his torn sleeve.
"I caught this man! I'm giving him to you!" he cried. "Don't forget that! I caught him for you!"
"That won't help you," the sergeant answered, as the 2 convicts were handcuffed.
"I don't expect it to help me. I caught him, and that's enough for me,"
my convict answered. The other convict's clothes were torn, and his face was bloody, but I could still see the scar on his cheek.
"He tried to murder me, Sergeant,"
the young man said.
"Tried?"
my convict repeated.
"Do you think I would try and not succeed? No, I caught him and held him here. I could have escaped, but I wouldn't let this gentleman get away. He tricked me once. I'll not let him trick me again."
"He tried to murder me," the other man repeated weakly.
"He's lying. He always was a liar," my convict answered. "We were put on trial together, and he lied at the trial. He was scared of me then, and he's scared of me now. Look at him. Look at the gentleman convict, shaking with fear." "That's enough," the sergeant said. "Light the torches there," he shouted to the soldiers.
It was very dark now. There was no moon. In the light of the torches, my convict turned and saw me for the first time.
"Wait a minute,"
my convict said to the sergeant.
"I wish to say something. I don't want anyone to be blamed for what I did. A man must eat. I took drink and food from the village. I took bread, cheese, brandy and a meat pie from the blacksmith's house."
"Has a pie been stolen from you?" the sergeant asked Joe.
"Yes. My wife found out it was missing at the very moment you came in," Joe answered. "That's right, isn't it, Pip?" "Then I'm very sorry I ate your pie, blacksmith," the convict said, not looking at me. "You're welcome to it, poor miserable fellow," Joe said kindly. "We don't know what you've done, but we wouldn't want you to starve, would we, Pip?"
The convict wiped his torn sleeve across his eyes and turned away. Joe and I watched as the 2 men were led away towards the sea and the prison ships. Days later, when I saw Joe looking for his file in the forge, I nearly told him the truth. But I was a coward, and too afraid of what he would think of me. Chapter 3. At Miss Havisham's. One evening, about 2 years later, Joe and I were sitting together by the fire. Mrs. Joe had gone to town with Uncle Pumblechook in the pony cart. I had learned to read and write a little, and Joe was very proud of me. I was trying to teach him the alphabet, but the only letters he could recognize were J, O, and E. "I think it's too late for me to learn, Pip, old chap," Joe said sadly. "I never went to school. My mother wanted me to go to school, but my father would not let me. He was a hard man, Pip. My father was a blacksmith. He kept me away from school and made me work for him. He was cruel to my mother and often beat her. That's why I let your sister do what she wants," Joe explained. "She's hard on you, I know, Pip, but she has a good heart. She looked after you when your mother and father died. She was looking after you when she agreed to marry me. 'Bring the poor little child,' I told her. 'There's room at the forge for him.'" I began to cry and to thank Joe for his kindness. I knew what a good friend he was to me. It was now 8 o'clock and dark outside. Joe put more coal on the fire. We stood by the door and listened for the sound of Uncle Pumblechook's pony cart. Not long afterwards, my sister and Uncle Pumblechook arrived. They stood and warmed themselves by our kitchen fire. As Mrs. Joe took off her bonnet and shawl, she looked at me sharply.
"Well, this boy should be grateful to me now," she cried.
Joe and I looked at each other in surprise.
Quite right, Uncle Pumblechook replied. "He should be grateful for the opportunity she's given him."
Joe and I were even more surprised.
"Well, what are you staring at?"
Mrs. Joe snapped. Her face was redder than ever with the cold. She was mentioned," Joe began politely.
"Miss Havisham isn't a he, I suppose?"
my sister answered sharply. "Miss Havisham who lives in town?" Joe asked in surprise. "How does Miss Havisham know Pip? She never leaves her house, does she?"
"She doesn't know Pip, but she does know Uncle Pumblechook," Mrs. Joe explained impatiently. "She wants a boy to go to her house and play. Uncle Pumblechook kindly mentioned this boy here. So he's going back to town with Uncle Pumblechook tonight, and tomorrow he'll play at Miss Havisham's, or I'll play with him."
Without another word, Mrs. Joe grabbed hold of me with her bony hands. She washed and scrubbed me until I could hardly breathe. Then I was dressed in my best clothes and given to Uncle Pumblechook. "Goodbye, Joe," I cried, as I was pushed out of the door by Mrs. Joe.
"Goodbye, and God bless you, Pip, old chap,"
Joe answered. In a moment, I was sitting in Uncle Pumblechook's pony cart, and we were on our way to town. At 10 o'clock the next morning, Uncle Pumblechook drove me to Satis house, where Miss Havisham lived. The house was very big and gloomy. The tall iron gates in front of the house were locked. Uncle Pumblechook rang the bell, and we waited. In a few minutes, a beautifully dressed girl came across the paved courtyard towards us. She was very pretty, and she looked very proud. "What name?" the girl asked.
"Pumblechook, and this is Pip,"
Uncle Pumblechook answered politely. "This is Pip, is it?" the girl said, looking at me scornfully. "Come in, Pip." The girl was carrying a large bunch of keys. She unlocked the gate with one of them and held the gate open. I went in, and Uncle Pumblechook started to follow, but the girl stopped him. "Do you wish to see Miss Havisham?" she asked.
If Miss Havisham wishes to see me, Uncle Pumblechook began. But she doesn't, the girl said sharply. Come along, boy. She locked the gate and led me across the courtyard. It was clean, but grass grew between the stones, as though no one ever walked there. I saw now that the girl was about my age, but she was so beautiful and so proud that she seemed much older. The big front door had chains across it. We walked on to a side door, and the girl opened it. Inside the house, everything was dark. The curtains were drawn, and the shutters were closed on all the windows. The girl picked up a burning candle, and this was our only light. She led me along several dark passages and up a wide staircase. At last, we came to a door where the girl stopped. "Go in," she said. "After you, miss," I whispered politely. "Don't be silly. I'm not going in," the girl answered, and she walked away, taking the candle with her. Feeling very afraid, I knocked at the door. "Come in," a woman's voice said quietly. I opened the door slowly and went inside. I looked around me in the greatest surprise. The room was large and full of furniture, but heavy curtains shut out the daylight, and the room was lit only by candles. I saw that I was in a lady's dressing room, and at the dressing table sat the strangest lady I had ever seen. She was dressed richly in satin and lace clothes, and everything she wore was white. A long white wedding veil hung down from her head. I saw with surprise that the lady's hair was white too. She wore bright jewels, and there were other jewels lying on the table in front of her. One of her shoes lay on the floor. The other one was lying on the dressing table. Her elbow was on the dressing table, and she was resting her face on her hand. Trunks full of clothes were placed about the room. Each one contained many silk and satin dresses, but the dresses were faded and torn. And then I saw that everything that had once been white was now faded and yellow. The fair young bride was now an old woman whose skin was yellow and wrinkled. Only her dark eyes showed that she was alive. Then the lady moved, and those dark eyes stared at me. "Who is it?" she asked. "Pip, ma'am. Mr. Pumblechook's boy. I've come to play." "Come here. Let me look at you," the lady said. I moved nearer, but I was afraid to look at her. Then I saw that a watch on the dressing table had stopped at 20 to 9. "Are you afraid to look at me?" the lady asked me slowly. "Are you afraid to look at a woman who hasn't seen the sunshine since before you were born?" "Look here," Miss Havisham whispered, touching her heart. "My heart is broken. Broken! And I am so tired. But I thought I would like to see a child play. So play, boy, play!" I stood there, unable to move, not knowing what to do. "Call Estella," Miss Havisham said at last. "Go to the door and call her." I was afraid, but I had to do what she asked. So I opened the door. I called out several times. Then I saw the girl walking towards me, the candle in her hand. Miss Havisham smiled as the beautiful girl came into the room. She held a jewel against Estella's pretty brown hair. "My jewels will be yours one day," Miss Havisham said quietly. Now I want you to play cards with this boy. This boy? But he's so common, Estella exclaimed. Look at his clothes. He's just a common working boy. Never mind, Miss Havisham whispered. You can break his heart, can't you? So, I played cards with Estella. When I made mistakes, she laughed at me, and so of course I made more. What rough hands this boy has, Estella exclaimed as I held the cards. And what heavy boots he's wearing. Why don't you answer her, Pip? Miss Havisham said at last. She says cruel things about you. What do you think of her? I don't want to say, I replied. Whisper to me, Miss Havisham said, bending down. I think she is very proud, I said quietly. Yes? And what else? I think she is very pretty, I went on. Anything else? I think she is very rude. And please, I added, I should like to go home now. Finish your game of cards first, Miss Havisham said. When Estella had won the last game, she threw the cards down with a scornful smile. Come here again in 6 days, Pip, Miss Havisham said as I was leaving. Take him downstairs, Estella. Give him something to eat and drink before he goes. I followed Estella down the gloomy stairs and along the dark corridors. She opened the side door, and the bright daylight hurt my eyes and confused me. Estella told me to wait in the courtyard. In a few minutes, she returned with some meat and bread. She placed the food on the ground, as though I was a dog. Tears came into my eyes. I turned my head away, so that Estella would not see me crying. But when she had gone, I cried aloud and kicked the wall with a heavy boot she had laughed at. After a time, Estella returned with her keys and unlocked the iron gate. "Why aren't you crying?" she asked me with a smile. "Because I don't want to," I replied. "Yes, you do," she said. "Your eyes are red with crying. You're nearly crying now." She laughed, pushed me outside the gate and locked it behind me. I went straight back to Uncle Pumblechook's, but he was not at home, so I began the long walk back to the forge alone. As I walked along, I thought about the strange things I had seen. I thought of Estella and her scorn. She had made me ashamed of my clothes, my boots, and most of all, myself. I wished I had never seen her. But then, I remembered how beautiful she was. Chapter 4. The Pale Young Gentleman. When I got home, my sister made me sit on a stool and began asking me questions. "Tell me what Miss Havisham looks like," my sister demanded. "What did she say to you? What did you do?" "Miss Havisham's very tall and dark," I answered quickly. "She was sitting in a black velvet coach. There was a girl with her. She gave us cake on gold plates." "Gold plates," Mrs. Joe repeated slowly. Then she added, "I hope you pleased her. She wanted you to play. Did you?" "Oh, yes. We played with flags," I said. "And then we shouted and waved our swords." "Swords?" "Yes. The girl, Estella, got them from a cupboard. And there was no daylight in the room. Only candles." Joe's eyes opened very wide. Why was I telling all these lies? I do not know. Perhaps the truth was too strange.
My visit to Miss Havisham had confused and frightened me, and Estella's words had hurt me. She had called me a common working boy. What would she think of Joe? How heavy his boots were. The following week, I walked to Miss Havisham's alone. As before, Estella unlocked the gate and took me into the house. "Am I pretty?" she said suddenly, holding up the candle. "Yes, very pretty," I answered. "Am I rude?" "Not so rude as last time." "Not so rude?" Estella repeated angrily, and she slapped my face hard. "What do you think now?" she asked. "I won't tell you," I said. "Then why don't you cry, you horrid common boy?" "I'm not crying. I'll never cry for you again," I answered. But I was crying as I spoke. And God knows, I cried for Estella many, many times afterwards. As we were going upstairs, we passed a tall man with sharp eyes and thick black eyebrows. His large hands were very clean and white. "Who's this?" the man asked, staring at me. "Only a boy," Estella answered. The man held my chin in his hand and stared into my eyes. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Miss Havisham asked me to come," I whispered. "Did she? Then behave yourself," the man said as he went on down the stairs. Miss Havisham was sitting in her dressing room. She was wearing the same torn dress as before. Everything in the room was the same. "So, you're back again," Miss Havisham said. "Are you ready to play today?" I was too frightened to answer. "Well, if you can't play, can you work?" Miss Havisham asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Then go into the room on the other side of the corridor. Wait there till I come." The room I entered was very big. In the middle of the room was a long table. By the light of the fire and the many candles, I saw that the torn tablecloth was covered with dust. There was something tall and white on the table, too. It was covered with dust, and fat black spiders were running all over it. Miss Havisham came into the room and stood behind me. She placed her hand on my shoulder and pointed at the table with a walking stick. "Look, Pip," she said. "Can you see my wedding cake? Eaten by mice and spiders. Ruined." Miss Havisham held my shoulder hard with her thin hand. "Help me walk, Pip," she said. We walked slowly round and round the long table, the strange old lady leaning on my shoulder. "Today is my birthday, Pip," Miss Havisham said. "Many years ago it should have been my wedding day. The dress I am wearing now was new then, and I was young. Everything is old and ruined now. Time has ruined me too, and broken my heart." What could I say? We stood there, very quiet in the candlelight. "Call Estella," Miss Havisham said at last. "Play with her again. I want to see her beat you at cards again." So Estella and I played cards. She won every game. Miss Havisham smiled and held bright jewels against Estella's hair. How beautiful the proud girl looked. Miss Havisham was soon tired, and I was sent downstairs. When I had eaten, I walked sadly through the courtyard and into an overgrown garden. No one had looked after the garden for years. Weeds grew everywhere. Turning a corner, I came face to face with a fair-haired boy of my own age. "Hello," said this pale young gentleman. "Who let you in?" Miss Estella, I answered.
Oh, did she? Then let's fight.
I stared at the boy in surprise. Then suddenly he pulled my hair and hit me hard in the stomach with his head. I was so surprised that I hit him hard.
So, you do want to fight, do you?
The pale young gentleman cried.
Come on, then.
Then he raised his fist like a boxer and began waving them in front of my face. I hit him again, and he fell backwards onto the ground. When he got up, his nose was bleeding. A minute later, I had hit him in the eye. "You've won," he said weakly. "Shake hands." So we shook hands, and the young gentleman walked quietly away. Estella was waiting for me at the gate. Her eyes were bright and shining. I knew she'd been watching the fight. "You can kiss me if you like," she said. I was confused but happy. I kissed her gently on the cheek. A few minutes later, I began my long walk home. From that day onwards, I visited Miss Havisham 3 times a week. I did not see the pale young gentleman again, but Estella was always there. On every visit, I pushed Miss Havisham round and round those 2 rooms in a wheelchair. She did not walk with me again. Instead, I pushed her in her chair. As I walked behind her, Miss Havisham questioned me. I told her I was going to be apprenticed to Joe when I was old enough. I told her that I knew nothing, but wanted to know everything. I told her I wanted to be educated. I told her how I wanted to be a gentleman. Perhaps I hoped that Miss Havisham would pay for my education, but she never suggested it. Sometimes Estella was kind to me, but more often she was rude and cruel. I could not understand this proud, beautiful girl who made me so unhappy. Chapter 5. I must become a gentleman. My life went on without change for 2 or 3 years. One day, Miss Havisham looked up at me and said,
You're getting tall, Pip. What is the name of your brother-in-law, the blacksmith?
Joe Gargery, ma'am, I answered.
It is time for you to be apprenticed to him, Miss Havisham said. Bring him with you one day. Bring him soon.
So, 2 days later, Joe put on his Sunday clothes and boots. Looking very awkward and uncomfortable, he walked with me to Satis house, where Miss Havisham lived. Estella opened the gate for us. She smiled scornfully at Joe, and I felt ashamed of him. Joe was so afraid of Miss Havisham that he refused to look at her. He stood near the door, turning his hat round and round in his strong hands. Miss Havisham picked up a little bag from her dressing table. She held it out to Joe.
It is time Pip became your apprentice, she said. Pip has earned his premium, and here it is. There are 25 guineas in this bag, Pip, she said to me. Give them to Joe Gargery. He is your master now. Goodbye.
And she turned away. I looked at Miss Havisham and Estella in despair. "But don't you want me to come again, Miss Havisham?" I asked.
No, Pip. Gargery is your master, and you must work for him. Pip has been a good boy here, Miss Havisham said to Joe. This money is his reward. You are an honest man, and will not expect more. Let them out, Estella.
Bitterly disappointed, I led Joe from that strange room. He walked like a man in a dream. And so I became a blacksmith, From that day, I lived in fear. Fear that Estella might see me at work with my dirty face and dirty hands. In my mind, I saw her beautiful face, with its hard, scornful smile. A year passed. I still thought about Estella every day. I longed to see Estella again. So I decided to go to Satis house. I asked Joe for a holiday, and he agreed to close the forge for a day. When I reached Satis house, the gate was opened by a servant.
"I hope you want nothing more, Pip. You'll get no more money from me," Miss Havisham said when she saw me. "That is not why I am here, Miss Havisham," I replied. "I want you to know I am doing well in my apprenticeship, that is all. I shall always be grateful to you." "Well, Pip, you can come and see me sometimes," Miss Havisham answered. "Come every year on your birthday. As you see, I am alone now." I hope Estella is well," I said. "Estella is very well," Miss Havisham replied, "and she is more beautiful than ever. She is in France, being educated to be a lady. Do you feel that you have lost her, Pip?" she added with a cruel smile. I could not answer. Miss Havisham laughed. I said goodbye to her and walked sadly home. When I reached the forge, I was surprised to see a crowd of people outside. I ran into the kitchen. Joe was there, and the doctor. My poor sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, was lying quiet and still on the floor. Someone had attacked Mrs. Joe when she was alone in the house. She was not dead, but terribly injured, unable to walk or speak. My sister lay in bed for many weeks. At last, she was able to sit downstairs, but her sharp voice was quiet forever. She never spoke again. From that day onwards, someone had to look after Mrs. Joe all the time. And so, Biddy came into our lives. Biddy was the same age as me, but she was not beautiful like Estella. How could she be beautiful? She was only a common girl from the village. But Biddy's eyes were bright. She had a sweet smile and was sensible and kind. The years passed. I visited Satis house every year on my birthday. I never saw Estella, but I did not forget her. I longed to be educated like Estella. I wanted Estella to think well of me and to like me. I wanted Estella's respect and admiration. How stupid I was. It was summer. One Sunday afternoon, Biddy and I went for a walk on the marshes. There were ships on the river, sailing slowly towards the sea. I remembered Estella, far away in another country. I began, as usual, to dream of my plans for the future. We sat down by the river and watched the water flow slowly by. "Biddy, I am going to tell you a secret," I said. "You must never speak of it to anyone." Biddy looked at me in surprise. She promised to tell no one. "Biddy," I went on, "I hate being a blacksmith like Joe. I want to be a gentleman." Biddy smiled and shook her head. "Oh no, Pip," she answered. "That wouldn't be right at all." "But I have important reasons for wanting to be a gentleman," I told her. "Don't you think you are happier as you are, Pip?" Biddy said gently. "Happy?" I repeated. "I can never be happy here, Biddy. Someone I admire and respect very much said I'm stupid and common. I must become a gentleman. I must." called you stupid and common?" Biddy asked. "That was not a true or a polite thing to say." "A young lady I met at Miss Havisham's," I replied. "The young lady is beautiful, and I love her very much. She is the reason why I must become a gentleman." "Do you want to be a gentleman to hurt her, or to make her respect you?" Biddy asked me quietly. "I don't know." "I think you should forget her," Biddy said. "She has been rude and cruel to you. The young lady is not worth your respect." "You may be right, Biddy," I said. "I believe you are, but I love her very, very much." Tears came into my eyes. I threw myself on the ground in despair. Biddy touched my hair gently. "Thank you for telling me this, Pip," she said. "I will always keep your secret." I sat up. "And I will always tell you everything, Biddy dear," I said. "Yes, I'm sure you will, Pip," Biddy replied. She smiled sadly. But I had not told Biddy everything. I believed that Miss Havisham had plans for me. I hoped that she would give me money for my education, money to make me a gentleman. If I had money and education, Estella would love me as I loved her. I hoped that Miss Havisham would make it possible for me to marry Estella. Chapter 6. Great Expectations. The months and years went by. I had been Joe's apprentice for 4 years. One evening, Joe and I were sitting in the village inn. A stranger came in, a big, tall man with heavy eyebrows. The man had large, very clean white hands. To my surprise, I recognized the man. I had seen him at Miss Havisham's many years before. He had frightened me then. He frightened me a little now.
"I think there is a blacksmith here, name of Joe Gargery,"
the man said in his loud voice. "That's me," Joe answered. He stood up.
"You have an apprentice, known as Pip," the stranger went on. "Where is he?"
"Here," I cried, standing beside Joe.
"I wish to speak to you both. I wish to speak to you privately. Not here," the man said. "Perhaps I could go home with you."
We walked back to the forge in silence. When we were in the sitting room, the man began to speak.
"My name is Jaggers," he said. "I am a lawyer in London, where I am well known. I have some unusual business with young Pip here. I am speaking for someone else, you understand. A client who doesn't want to be named. Is that clear?"
Joe and I nodded.
"I have come to take your apprentice to London," the lawyer said to Joe. "You won't stop him from coming, I hope?"
"Stop him? Never!" Joe cried.
"Listen, then. I have this message for Pip. He has great expectations."
Joe and I looked at each other, too surprised to speak.
"Yes, great expectations," Mr. Jaggers repeated. "Pip will one day be rich, very rich. Pip is to change his way of life at once. He will no longer be a blacksmith. He is to come with me to London. He is to be educated as a gentleman. He will be a man of property."
And so, at last, my dream had come true. Miss Havisham, because Mr. Jaggers' client must be Miss Havisham, had plans for me after all. I would be rich, and Estella would love me. Mr. Jaggers was speaking again.
"There are
2 conditions," he said, looking at me. "First, you will always be known as Pip. Secondly," Mr. Jaggers continued, "the name of your benefactor is to be kept secret. One day that person will speak to you face to face. Until then, you must not ask any questions. You must never try to find out this person's name. Do you understand? Speak out."
Yes, I understand," I answered. "My benefactor's name is to remain a secret."
"Good," Mr. Jaggers said. "Now, Pip, you will come into your property when you come of age, when you are 21. Until then, I am your guardian. I have money to pay for your education and to allow you to live as a gentleman. You will have a private teacher. His name is Mr. Matthew Pocket, and you will stay at his house."
I gave a cry of surprise. Some of Miss Havisham's relations were called Pocket. Mr. Jaggers raised his eyebrows.
"Do you not want to live with Mr. Pocket? Have you any objection to this arrangement?" he said severely.
No, none at all," I answered quickly.
"Good. Then I will arrange everything," Mr. Jaggers went on. "Mr. Pocket's son has rooms in London. I suggest you go there. Now, when can you come to London?"
I looked at Joe. "At once, if Joe has no objection," I said. "No objection, Pip, old chap," Joe answered sadly.
"Then you will come in 1 week's time," Mr. Jaggers said, standing up. "You will need new clothes. Here is some money to pay for them. 20 guineas.
He counted out the money and put it on the table.
"Well, Joe Gargery, you're saying nothing,"
Mr. Jaggers said to Joe sternly.
"I have money to give you, too."
"Money? What for?" Joe asked.
"For loss of your apprentice,"
Mr. Jaggers answered.
"Mr. Pip has been your apprentice, and now you are losing him."
Dear Joe placed his heavy hand gently on my shoulder. "Pip must go free," Joe said. "Let him go free. Let him have his good fortune. No money can replace the dear child. We've always been the best of friends, Pip and me. Ever the best of friends." Joe could not say any more. He wiped away a tear. And so, my whole life changed. How happy I was! But Biddy and Joe were sad and quiet. This upset me. Why were they not pleased at my good fortune? The next few days passed slowly for me. I bought new clothes, boots, and a hat. I decided to say goodbye to Miss Havisham before I left for London.
"How smart you look, Pip," Miss Havisham said when she saw me. "You look like a gentleman. Why is this?"
"I have had good fortune since I last saw you, Miss Havisham," I said with a smile. "I am so grateful, Miss Havisham, so grateful."
I know. I have seen Mr. Jaggers, Pip," Miss Havisham answered. "He tells me you have great expectations. You now have a rich benefactor, and you are leaving for London tomorrow."
"Yes, Miss Havisham."
"Well, be good then, Pip, and do what Mr. Jaggers tells you. Goodbye, Pip. You must keep the name of Pip, you know."
"Goodbye, Miss Havisham." Miss Havisham smiled and held out her hand. I bowed and kissed it. On my last evening at the forge, Biddy cooked a special supper, and I wore my new clothes. The London coach left the town at 6 o'clock the next morning. I told Biddy and Joe that I wanted to walk to the town alone. Was I ashamed to be seen with them there? I'm afraid I was. I said goodbye to Mrs. Joe, then to Biddy and Joe. Biddy and Joe were both in tears as I waved goodbye for the last time. I walked on, and then my own tears began to fall. As I got nearer to the town, the morning mist disappeared and the sun shone. I was on my way to London. I was a young man with great expectations.